Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of the Custom Hearthstone Community Podcast. Real quick, once again, I am Birb.
I'm Maysick.
And I am Scorpiosis.
And I just want to give a quick shout out to both KH and CoolBoyPie on Reddit for leaving feedback on episode 2. We are also trying to get this podcast out on Apple Podcasts. I think it's free, so it should be pretty easy to do. And from here on out, we're going to try to make the episodes a little bit shorter so we can also get them out a little quicker and hopefully cover more topics.
Yep, so this week's episode, with the shorter focus, we are going to be looking at a little bit more obscure of a design topic, and it's a type of design that we like to call DIY design.
So normally there's two common methods of designing a card, known as bottom up and top down. These are recognized both within the Hearthstone and Magic and other communities. Bottom up is purposeful design starting with the mechanics, so you usually have a specific idea in mind for a card, you get the mechanics ironed out, and then you pick a fitting flavor, whereas top down takes the flavor first and finds a fitting effect, and you're trying to tell a story with the card usually. However, top down and bottom up only encompass the two most basic ways of approaching card design. And DIY design, on the other hand, is a term we've kind of coined in the Custom Hearthstone community to describe cards that make the reader do work, hence DIY. So the reader is doing it themselves, basically. And the most important agent in DIY design is the audience, and more specifically, the split-second moment of when someone is reading a card and trying to figure out what the card actually does.
Yeah, one thing to note about DIY design is that it's not necessarily designed well from a gameplay perspective, as it can appear too flashy from just like looking at it and then playing it. It'll feel kind of bland, so you got to watch out for that.
Yeah, so to sort of explain DIY design in more detail, because it is sort of a abstract and not well-defined concept, DIY design is all about how the card works when it's read for the first time, and when the audience is trying to understand this card. And so I would draw a parallel to the way that jokes work and sort of the psychological processes that make jokes funny. So the way that several jokes work is that the reader finds it funny because they have to put in some effort to figure out what happens. The joke will set up some situation, it'll give some punchline, and then the audience member has to make the connection between these two things. And because the audience member made the connection themselves, instead of the joke just being spelled out to them, that's what makes it funny. That moment of connection. And it doesn't have to take a long time for the reader to figure it out, but as long as it's them, it gives them this sense of like sort of ownership and enthusiasm for the card that wouldn't otherwise exist. And so as Scorpiosis has said, because this is all about initial presentation, the reader figuring out how the card works for the first time, it doesn't necessarily correlate with good gameplay because it's all about presentation, but presentation is also something important in your cards.
So to give an example, we'll just show our first card, and I'm going to give a couple seconds to kind of process the card. I'm going to read it out loud. It's a 6 mana 7/7 Druid Legendary Munchroot. It says remove one word. Your minions cost 3 more, and you can remove your or more. And this is made by Frostivus. Okay, so now that I've let that sit a little bit, I'm going to briefly introduce how we kind of came to understand or come up with the idea of DIY design. So when this card was posted, it made like the top of the subreddit. I think it's like the 3rd of all time right now. A lot of people really like it, and I was talking with Birb about how I love this card a lot, and he says, really, I don't think it's that interesting of a card. And I was like, well, yeah, when you look at the actual gameplay elements, which we'll talk about in a second, it's not super interesting, but I like this card because I figured it out. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, so did 2,000 other people on Reddit. And so part of the reason people like this card so much is because they have a personal attachment to it, because they figured out how this card works.
Yeah, I think the factors that go into people liking this card are probably in most cases subconscious. You look at this card, you take a few moments, you figure out how it works. For me, for example, the first thing, remove one word. Your minions cost 3 more. So first I read your minions cost 3 more. I try removing your. The effect becomes minions cost 3 more. I remove more. The effect becomes your minions cost 3. And then if you remove both, it just says minions cost 3. And the fact that I sort of had to go case by case, enumerate all of the possible card effects, and see this card, which originally says remove one word, like, what does that do? What removing words, how would that change this card? And then I work on it, I figure it out, and oh, here are the 2 possible effects. Now the thing is that once many people figure this out, that's when they hit the upvote button, write a nice comment, and move on. But if you actually stop for a second, look at this card, most of the time it is choose one, your minions cost 3, or minions cost 3 more. And while this could create some interesting gameplay moments, it's not necessarily, like, it is essentially a regular choose one effect. It's not particularly legendary, it's not particularly, like, top of all time worthy. And so that's why this card became sort of the quintessential example of DIY design, because the way that this card is presented, the fact that it's a puzzle to the reader figures it out, they get the moment of aha, and then become attached to it, even though the card itself is not necessarily stellar in terms of gameplay. That's what created the concept of DIY design.
Yeah, another thing that's specifically relevant to this card is that Vandrel Staghelm works with it, assumingly. I mean, it doesn't have choose one exactly, but mechanically it is choose one. So, and if the audience recognizes that when they look at the card, it adds another layer of discovery, which essentially doubles the appeal of the card from face up.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That second layer of discovery is definitely, and I mean, you could imagine this from the eyes of a Redditor. Like, if someone feels like they've found even deeper meaning, they're like, oh, I want to leave a comment. I want to talk about this card because I feel like I've really gotten something cool out of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely.
I definitely, the most impressive part about this card to me is that each of the 4 individual outcomes all work and they all make sense and they're all different and unique and cool. And specifically props to Frostivus for designing a card like this. Like, it's really impressive. And we're going to look at one other card of his later in the episode. He's probably like the master of DIY design. Just a master of design in the community, honestly, in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess we can move on to a not custom card, which is actually Blizzard's card in the Boomstay project, and that is Stargazer Luna. So it's a 3-mana 2/4 mage legendary, and it says after you play the rightmost card in your hand, draw a card.
Yeah, I don't think we need to give the... So normally for this episode, we want to give time to let people discover the card for themselves in the true spirit of DIY. But since this is a card that has already been revealed, I don't think we need that. So what I think is the DIY aspect of this card is the significance of how does rightmost card in your hand work with the draw card effect. And I think this one is relatively easy to figure out, especially compared to Munchroot, that when you draw a card, that card is the rightmost card in your hand. And the image that, at least for me, that this immediately conjured is a sort of Miracle Rogue, Gadgets and Auctioneer, just playing cards off the top of your deck, long chains of cheap spells, and that's the image that this card immediately produces. And not only is that an image very fun and compelling, Miracle Rogue has been a loved archetype for a long time, but the player feels as if they figured it out themselves. And that's what I think this card was very well received by the player base, and I think that this sort of subconscious, this very subtle riddle worked into the card is a big factor in that.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned even not only the subconscious riddle, but the following image, or like same thing appeared in my head, just like cards flying out of the right spot of the hand, just wisps and 1-cost cards and 0-cost cards, and both that riddle and image appearing in the reader's head really helped them feel like, oh, I figured out Stargazer Luna. Like, it's not a super hard card to figure out, but I did it.
Yeah, I think the appeal starts to pick up pace once you figure out that the rightmost card in your hand is usually where the drawn cards are going to be anyway. Right. So once you get the chain going in your mind, you kind of get distracted with all the possibilities, and it's really just fun to think about.
Yeah, and something, now I have not played around with Stargazer Luna, although I actually did get her as my free legendary, is, in a practical game, free cost is very low, but in a deck where you run a bunch of in a mage deck where you run a bunch of cheap spells, waiting until you have a bunch of mana to play them all in a long chain may not happen all that often. And also, the combo breaks if you draw a card you can't play, but that's not the point. The point is that this card is presented in a way such that the immediate image that it gives you is the successful, this beautiful long combo chain. And so whether or not that's practical, whether or not this card is actually useful or interesting in the average gameplay scenario, it makes a huge positive impact.
Yeah, I agree. Another thing to point out about this card is both this card and Soul Infusion, correct me if I'm wrong, are the 2 first hand positioning matters cards in Hearthstone. And I find it especially interesting that Stargazer, so Soul Infusion, not a very interesting card, gives less most minion in your hand, +2/+2. Stargazer Lunar, on the other hand, like immediately goes to one of the most, well, not most complicated, but most interesting effects, which is the whole draw card already being the rightmost card in your hand. So it's kind of interesting that they're one of their first hand positioning cards like already explores this really interesting outcome.
Anyways, the next card we'll be doing is another one by Frostivus, as he is kind of the master of DIY design, and it is called Too Many Cooks. It is a 3-mana epic druid spell with the text, choose one or all, deal 4 damage, gain a mana crystal, or discard a random card. And I'm going to give a pause to allow you to think about this.
All right, time's up. All right. Well, one thing that probably came to mind is why the heck would I want to discard a random card? I mean, that's one of the most obvious reactions that you should have. But then you must probably realize that choosing all, having that third discard effect, which is strictly negative, balances out the second option, which is basically the main appeal of this card.
Yep, that's sort of the riddle. You have a choose one effect where you seem to be given this third bad option, but you realize that the purpose of that is so that the choose all has a drawback.
And the flavor on this card is just like, oh my gosh, it's perfect. Too many cooks.
The flavor
you pick the third cook and it ruins everything.
And I like how you sort of have, I mean, the art fits perfectly. I believe it's from League of Legends, but it's excusable in this case. You have 3 cooks, you have 3 effects, each one does a different thing. One of them, I guess, is the bad cook, and you can sort of choose to include all of them, in which case the meal, well, you'll have 2 good cooks and 1 bad one, or you can just choose one of the 2 good ones. Or maybe if you're a masochist, you can play this card as 3 mana, discard a random card. So yeah.
I mean, you need that Fist of Jaraxxus lethal in Druid, right?
and this actually kind of segues into a point where, like we said, not all DIY design cards are automatically well designed from a gameplay standpoint. So, for example, 2 kind of issues I see with this card is, it doesn't make sense why you would ever choose the discard a random card option, and it also doesn't really make sense that discard is in Druid. Obviously, we see a couple instances of discard mechanically bleeding into other classes like Astral Communion in Druid or Book of Specters in Mage, but this type of discard is functionally identical to cards like Succubus, which are just like random discard a card from your hand. So I don't necessarily love that about this card, but I think it's like kind of necessary for this card to work.
Yeah, so when we actually go off of, like, instead of thinking about this card from a DIY design perspective, thinking about it from a gameplay perspective, so you have several options. One is 3 mana, deal 4 damage, which is quite good, especially in Druid, which, aside from Swipe, and I guess their Spellstone doesn't have a whole lot of direct damage. That's quite good. You have 3 mana, gain a Mana Crystal, which is notably not empty, so it is comparable to Wild Growth. Or you have, do both and discard a random card. These 3 options are relatively, I guess maybe the word is mundane. They're not nuanced effects. We've seen them before. The thing that's nuanced about them is the combinations and possible versatility. And I think with cards like Branching Paths, that may be acceptable to say, the effects aren't interesting, but the choices you have to make are interesting, and that's why this card is worth existing. I think that, with the good flavor, with the obvious flashiness, I'm actually... I like this card.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that I would change with this card. I think it just goes to show that sometimes you do need to make sacrifices for DIY design.
Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely, as Maysick said, it's kind of annoying that the third option is just always bad, or almost always bad. But, that's sort of the price of DIY design.
All right. Our next card is Charged Vessel by bman1014 on Reddit. It is a 0 mana, 0/1 neutral minion that says, can cost less than 0 as its card text.
So this one might not be as difficult to figure out. Maybe it is, I don't know. But as you may know, cards are limited at a minimum of 0 mana, And so the immediate reaction to this card is if you can find a way to reduce its cost below 0, you have a -1 costing mana card, and then you play it, and it's an Innervate.
Oh, I forgot Innervate doesn't give you 2
a coin. A coin. Sure.
One thing I think about this card is that is specifically unique out of all the examples we're going to cover today is that it breaks the rules of a mechanic which we previously knew to be true. See Emperor Thaurissan, reduce the cost of cards in your hand. It would never go below 0. 0 was the lowest it could go, and everyone in Hearthstone would get used to that after a while. But this card, it takes that mechanic and puts it on its head, and you totally have this new area to think about. It's like, whoa, what if it could go below 0? What would that even do? And that's kind of the wow factor of this card, because most likely you'd be gaining mana.
Right, I think that's the intent.
And one of the things that I think that what makes this work even better in this case is, well, I don't know, at least in sort of my experience, I've always kind of maybe cracked jokes about, how something that managed to deal negative damage would be healing, or something that managed to cost negative mana would sort of gain you mana. And I think that, like, in a lot of players' minds, maybe this is sort of a concept that's kind of dormant, of like, oh, if a card could cost less than 0, it would give you mana.
I think this is definitely
and
something
this card
players have thought about before, and so they're like, oh, there's my thought as a card.
Now, something that's interesting, not necessarily related to DIY design, it's just the fact that, like, if we were to be nitpicky about other aspects of this card, the art is not really up to par. There's missing punctuation in the card text. There's no rarity gem or watermark. So the card is, the presentation of the card is very suboptimal. So it's interesting that we have all sort of found this to be one of the most interesting DIY design cards that we've seen from the Custom Hearthstone fan base. And DIY is totally an element of presentation.
That's definitely true about how DIY design, being a very presentation-focused design strategy, can manage to produce interesting cards even when the presentation is subpar, as it is in this card. Another thing I'd like to nitpick about this card is the fact that it's a 0/1 minion. It makes it very undesirable to play, and even when you do play it for the extra mana, you just have something kind of sitting there on the board.
Yeah, so again, with DIY design, since a card can, be really appealing, but you don't get the guarantee that it's actually a good card for the game. When you actually think about this card, there are very few ways to make use of its effect. Emperor Thaurissan comes to mind, but there are not really that many ways. I mean, I can't really think of Farsight, maybe. We've kind of collectively come up with this threshold of, I think for me, I usually say around 8 cards. If you introduce a sort of new mechanic, it should be able to function with at least 8 cards in the game. Yeah. And I don't think that this card gets anywhere near 8 cards. And what that does is that, you just don't have any room to experiment.
Yeah.
There's no ways to use it.
A pretty easy way to fix it, or at least help it, would be adding a tribal tag, because there's a lot of tribal-specific cost reduction, but that's also kind of dangerous. I think making it a mech would definitely be a mistake, since we have Mech Orber and Galvanizer, but something like Elemental with Fireplume Harbinger might work.
Yeah. And without the tribal tag, and maybe even with it, as a 0-mana 0/1, which is it's extremely conditional. Like, cost reduction even within tribes is very rare, and usually when you cost reduce a card, the power is that you're getting a more powerful card early. But the only thing that this will do when it's cost reduced is, you get a coin, or maybe you get like an old Innervate,
which could be potentially interesting for combo players.
Which is, I mean, yeah, that is potentially strong, but the issue is just that there's so few cards that work with it that I feel like when this card actually works, it needs to be much more impactful than it actually is.
So the next card, our final DIY design card, is a card I've made, so we can be a little more critical on this one, because I'm willing to discuss some of the issues this card has. It's a 5-mana mage rare spell, Polymorph Dragon. It says Echo, transform a minion into a 1/1 whelp, or a whelp into a 12/12 dragon. So this one might not be as tough to figure out as some of the other cards, but the main draw here is that when you read transform a minion into 1/1 whelp, you're thinking enemy minions, and then when you read whelp into a 12/12 dragon, you're thinking, why would I want to transform this thing I just transformed into a 12/12 dragon? And you realize you can use it on your own minions.
you kind of have a similar thought process to that of the choose one cards we looked at earlier, in that you can either play it once for 5 mana because of the echo effect, and then you have to think about what that would result in, and then you also have to consider playing twice for 10 mana, and then it also has a different result.
Right, because it could be 2 polymorphs or 1 10-mana 12/12 thingy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think like when the reader sees the echo effect, they immediately think, okay, so I'm going to be playing this card multiple times. They see like Maysick said, they see transform a minion into a 1/1. They think this is a polymorph, but then they see the 12/12 and they're like, wait, I need to use this on my friendly minions. This forces them to go back, reevaluate the card, and realize that this comes down to, oh, okay, so it's either a 5-mana polymorph or it's a 10-mana transform into a 12/12. And again, that is the essential process involved in DIY design.
And like we've been doing with every card in this episode, I want to talk about some of the pitfalls or mistakes this card has made, I guess. And obviously this is my card, so I'd like to say this is probably a poor use of Echo, since Blizzard wanted to evoke this feeling of, using these cards at variable cost for different reasons, but this is just kind of a very binary Echo card. It's kind of strange that it can transform whelps into dragons when whelps are tokens already generated by other cards. Some players might see that as like a challenge, a deck building challenge, but that was not my intent with this card, so I probably should have addressed that.
Yeah, sort of similarly to the previous card. If you look at this card from the design standpoint of, what if I can get a whelp on my side of the board already, and then this is a 5-mana 12/12. The issue with that is just whelp generation is, in a similar way to cost reduction, and maybe even to a greater extent, is so limited and hard to get that there's maybe like a couple of cards that could do it, that it doesn't really work. This card doesn't sort of work in that sense as like an archetype pusher, like whelp mage in a sense. And it's possible that if this were part of a larger set, and in that set lots of whelp generating tokens were established, and this card was balanced around the fact that there are lots of ways to get whelps, then maybe it could work in that sense. When it's just posted in isolation with really nothing in the game to work with, then from that angle the card doesn't work. And because I think that's a very interesting angle, the fact that the card sort of falls through on it is a pretty big blow to this card's sort of viability.
I agree. So I guess we can just wrap up our thoughts on DIY design as a whole. I think the biggest takeaway for DIY design is that you're usually going to have to make concessions to the actual gameplay and how good it feels to play the card. In some cases it's fixable, like in Polymorph Dragon and Charged Vessel. In some cases it's kind of just a trade-off, like too many cooks.
But I think something that's important to remember about DIY design is that not every card in your set is going to be a masterpiece of fun to use. And so if you have a card that is, very flashy, very interesting to figure out, something that really gets the players hyped about the expansion, even if it falls through in the game, that might be okay, because ultimately your goal in game design is to create a product that sells. And having these sort of flashy cards that users have a good time figuring out can sort of help with that. Like sort of an example I'd like to point to. In Witchwood, there was a card revealed called Nightmare Amalgam, which is not necessarily an example of DIY design. But I felt that in a similar sense to DIY design, the card is a lot more interesting in theory than it actually is in practice, because in practice it is a 3-mana 3/4 minion of a particular tribe.
Usually Murloc or Dragon.
Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, that card, people went crazy
yeah.
when it was revealed. Maybe it's just because the idea of something that is all tribes is really cool and it's really flashy. People got excited about it, and that probably contributed a lot to the success of Witchwood as a whole. So I think that when you're thinking about game design, on the grand scale, not just coming up with custom Hearthstone card ideas, but selling a product, DIY design is not something that you necessarily want to stray away from.
I definitely agree. That macro lens is really important, and probably something that shouldn't really be considered when making a single custom card, but definitely something that should be considered when you're looking at the whole scheme of things, or if you're making an expansion.
Yeah, just a couple tips if you were interested in this kind of design. I wouldn't strive to make these kind of cards. They should come naturally. If you're making a set, for example, you'd want these kind of cards to be like the front runners, the ones that you show off as like the first 5 cards of your expansion. Blizzard tends to do that. You could probably argue that one card in most of the expansion reveals is DIY, or at least very flashy, and it gives you a lot of thought to discuss.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Scorp. I think that sort of the most organic way for a DIY design card to come about, and the one that sort of guarantees. I mean, I think, as I said, it's kind of okay if a DIY design doesn't really hold up in game, but like if it does, that's great. And sort of the best way to do that is you kind of start by designing, whether that's top down or bottom up or, however you want to approach it. You start by designing a card, and you see sort of a more interesting way to implement that effect using DIY design.
Yeah, I agree. If you're trying to like really make a DIY design card, I would look at like wording intricacies like in Munchroot, or mechanical intricacies like in Charged Vessel, kind of exploring these edge cases and putting them onto cards.
Yeah, so I think the reason Maysick chuckled at what Scorp said is because Maysick, among us, is well known for trying to create specifically cards that are DIY design solely for the purpose of being flashy and getting karma.
What did you just say?
But I mean, I think that it's definitely an interesting challenge, and as Maysick said, playing with wording like Munchroot is one of the good ways to go about that. And also, something I'd like to point out is that Munchroot, Too Many Cooks, and Polymorph Dragon, so Munchroot and Too Many Cooks are sort of both choosing schema. They are interesting because the card offers you several choices in how you can use it, and Polymorph Dragon is done through Echo as opposed to choose one, but it's really the same thing. You're choosing between 2 different effects, and sort of giving players a choice, but making that choice
deceiving.
Accomplishing that choice in a more convoluted way than just literally choose one is one of the ways you can do DIY design.
Or deceiving, like Too Many Cooks and Polymorph Dragon both have this element of like, why would I want to do that? And then you're like, oh, that's why I would want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think that just about wraps it up. So if this week's topic seemed, weird, abstract, let us know in the comments. Definitely this is sort of new area we're venturing into by exploring this odd corner of design
that we have made up almost entirely.
Yeah, exactly. With the shorter episodes, we have opportunities to explore kind of niche topics like this. If you guys liked it, let us know, and if you didn't, also let us know. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks, and see you guys next time.